Sunjata. All right. I appreciate you so much for sharing your time with us. I really enjoyed your talk yesterday at Pathfinder Community School, and like I shared with another parent here, it's so nice to hear confirmation about major life decisions. And I'm glad I homeschooled, and I'm glad that I'm exploring independent education. So, Dr. Sundiata. Dr. Sundiata is an independent educator, anti-oppression activist, and social sustainability facilitator, and is the co-creator of GROW, a network of people and initiatives designed to promote and create social, economic, and political systems centered on liberation, sustainability, and unconditional love. Dr. Sunjata is also the host of the Theory of Indivisibility podcast, which analyzes the evolutionary origins, current complexities, and the future of our social, economic, and political systems. I'm so excited I did not stumble over those syllables. So I'm excited to listen and learn, and again receive confirmation about what you have to say about self-directed education, specifically for Black children and families. I'm so curious to hear what an anti-oppressive environment looks like. I really like that term, and the idea of putting on these oppression lenses, and it's like, what's oppressive here? Let's eliminate it. That's really exciting. And most importantly, how urgent is it to deliver this philosophy to our community? So I'm also in awe of your courage and bravery. For me personally, you're speaking new words, new concepts, new ideas, and I'm excited that it's coming from you.
Thank you.
That the deliverer looks like you. And I think, am I ready to say without further ado? Oh, and thank you for coming.
Yes.
Thank you for being here. I hope that this can be a safe place for us to grapple with this idea that self-directed education perhaps is good for us. And I want to share one of my questions. Because of our numbers here, you don't have to write your questions on postcards, but if that works best for you, please feel free to write your question down on the card and somehow pass it forward. And I just want to share one of my questions and then hide mine in the collection. One of my questions is, do you think we can say boldly or somewhat boldly that we were independent, self-directed educators and practitioners before European contact? That's one of your questions. And without further ado, thank you.
Thank you. So am I jumping into that question immediately?
That's a good question. Oh, I'm supposed to hand over to you. If I had a baton, Will, I would be passing it to you.
So I think that's an amazing question. And I think we're gonna get there, right?
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, so I'll get us there.
You'll get there? Okay.
I'll get us there.
Okay.
Will y'all trust me to get us there?
Indeed.
Cool. So, in preparation for this, I listened to some of your podcasts. I enjoyed the one on patriarchy and the one where you kind of break down this theory of indivisibility. And as you were talking about your podcast and leading up to this conversation, you talked about your educational background, right?
Yeah.
And kind of your story of becoming as a good entry point, right? Because it would offer, for the other Black folks in the room, probably some experiences that would resonate with them, right? In education, we talk about this idea of activating prior knowledge. Meaning that, like, what did you come in the room with?
Yeah.
And how do we leverage what you came in the room with to move us to a new space, right? And so we're going to try to activate some prior knowledge right now.
Absolutely.
And ask you about some of your earliest educational experiences, right?
Yeah.
What are some that really stick out for you as you were growing up? Like, man, what is this thing called education? When did you kind of start to understand that?
No doubt. Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being an audience. Thank you, Baleen, for creating this platform for me to share. Yeah, so I hated school growing up. You know, I grew up in a family of educators. So I'm from West Philly, PA, and I moved to Georgia. I currently live right outside Atlanta, but I moved there in 2007. But prior to that, so my mother and father met at FAMU. My mother came to FAMU from Philly. My dad is from Apalachicola, Florida. And so it starts on my dad's side of the family to kind of add context. So my dad's dad, my grandfather, my granddaddy, he was in the Army, grew up poor, all those things, born in 1920, but went to the Army and got the GI Bill and was able to go to college. So in his 30s, he went to undergrad at FAMU. And I call him like the cycle breaker, like of breaking poverty and those mindsets and oppressions in that way, and kind of set a foundation for the rest of us. But so my granddaddy went to school, got his degree in education, became a teacher in Ocala, Florida. And then he was hired back in his hometown of Apalachicola to be a principal of the segregated high school and called Dunbar. And, you know, he was military, disciplined, hard-nosed, disciplinarian principal type dude. Everybody in the community was afraid of him type of principal back in those days, right? So growing up, you know, his kids knew education is everything. So my dad and his siblings, they all were college educated. In the era, my granddaddy was one of the few people in his town to get a college degree in that era, right? So his kids knew that it was no question they were going to go to college and get degrees because he had already set that foundation. So my dad became a teacher. My aunt was a lawyer, and then she also became a teacher. And my uncle was a school principal out of their children, my grandparents' children. That's what they all did. So they all had a hand in education and being educators. And then my mother came from a poor family in Philly, and she was one of 10 children, but she was one of maybe, out of her siblings, 2 of them got college degrees. So my mother kind of broke that cycle from the education standpoint and going to that level on her side of the family. So now, my siblings and I, growing up, it was like college, education was everything. It's like no doubt we had to go that route. But growing up in Philly, in West Philly, I went to a school in the middle of the projects. My mom and dad weren't together. So the irony is, like, growing up, I went to a school in a poor neighborhood in the 80s during the height of the crack epidemic. So I saw all that comes with that. But every summer, so I was kind of like, my mom was working class on a teacher salary, you know, working class poor. We had welfare, all that stuff, right? But every summer I went to Florida to spend the summer with my grandparents, and they were at a higher, you know, social, economic status. You know, they were revered in the community. My grandfather drove nice cars, had a nice house, manicured lawn. So when I went to Florida, my friends thought I was like some rich kid, but in Philly, I was just a regular working class poor kid. So I kind of navigated both those economic worlds, but also understanding that education was like the way to get me to be like my grandfather, if that makes sense. But so growing up, I hated school, but I did it because it was like the expectation. But I hated it because I was always questioning things. Kind of, I was called rebellious because I questioned everything. I didn't just do things because, I always questioned why. So ultimately I navigated the system and eventually, you know, made my way into undergrad. But one of the things I said, based on my experiences growing up, is one of the things I said I would never do was become a teacher. I said, I'm never going to become a teacher, never going to do this education thing, because my mom, I saw what she went through. She was a teacher at the school I went to in the middle of the project, so I saw like all that she had to deal with, and I heard the stories, and you know, I saw parents come up and get in fights with teachers and like just all the drama that came with all that stuff. So I'm like, I'm never doing that. And so that gives you some context to kind of like those early years. And I went to school for business. So I eventually went to undergrad for business. Did you want to interject? You want me to kind of get into how I became a teacher?
Yeah, so I mean, help us a little bit, right, with what did you hate about school? Like you talked about the stuff that was outside of school, but help us a little bit. Like you're in this classroom, you're, I don't know, 12, 13 years old.
Right.
And you're like, man, I hate this. what do we see? Help us see this classroom.
Oh man, so what did I hate about it? It was like I excelled. I did the school thing well, just because I guess the genes and all these educators in my family, right? So it wasn't that I didn't excel, but the thing I didn't like about it was it wasn't about what I wanted to learn. Every day I stepped foot in that school, it was like all the questions that was going through my mind, all the curiosities I had, it was like, okay, put that to the side, because this is what you have to learn. This is what you need in order to, you know, be successful. And I think that's the part that I hated. It was never really about me. You know, it was about meeting the expectations of others. It was about learning what someone else said was important to learn. And it was like the things that I was curious and interested about didn't matter. I think that's, you know, when it comes to like the academia part of it, that's the thing I hated. I hated just the process, the rote memorization, just the standardization of it all. It just didn't feel good.
Yeah.
Especially when I got to high school. That was the worst.
So maybe I'm just gonna name a couple of things and take us to this next question, right? So like it didn't feel good, right? There was like an emotional, a visceral reaction that you had while you're in this space. You don't like being in this space. The type of
got
Android on the beat. So I'm sorry, I'm like a one-track mind person. It's hard. So that's the thing, and then the other piece that I heard you say is that the process of learning, right? So like how folks were asking you to learn was also like not something that you were cool with. Like this rote memorization, there's a certain way to type of learn, and then also I heard you talk about the content of the learning.
Yeah.
Right, so like what you had to learn about, right? So there's three different things. One, you got me learning about this stuff I don't care nothing about. Two, the way you want me to learn about it is not really that appealing to me. And then three, I don't actually like being here. Like the vibe is off.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
So now let's take those three things. You were about to kind of talk about what happened as you evolved into becoming an educator. How did you see those three things play out for your students? How does that show up? Like now you're in a classroom of your own. How did you feel like you were able to maybe change those things or feel constricted to keep those things the same?
All right, so we're fast forwarding to when I was a teacher. Basically, man, when I became a teacher, I was like intent on taking those experiences that I had and trying to do it differently. You know, trying to bring a level of creativity, a level of independence, a level of respect for the young people, and I wanted to, you know, like you said, just taking my bad experiences and bringing them into the classrooms that I led, and letting those young people know that their voice matters. You know what I mean? That was very important to me, and also just trying to give them some wiggle room and trying to like choose their own path and learn at their own pace and at their own interests, and just kind of do all those type of things. And ultimately what ended up happening was that I ended up bumping up against, you know, what I was supposed to do versus what I was trying to do. And me being the rebellious person that I am, and someone who's not afraid to like question authority or all these various structures and systems, I had this like little joke that I was like easily fireable because I just refused to do certain things, and I got in trouble. But you know, I was told you got to play the game. You know, my peers, the veteran teachers, was like, you know, they would call me Speed because that was my given name before I changed my name. But my last name used to be Speed, and they were like, Speed, you got to play the game. And I'm like, I don't want to play the game. These are children's lives. You know what I mean? These are children's lives that we're talking about, and that's not a game to me. You know what I mean? And I'm very empathetic to, you know, teachers who are able to make it work, because I understand the ways that the system's trapped them, and before they kind of awaken to some of the ways that the system does harm, the education system does harm. But it's like their livelihood is attached to it, and so people try to subvert it in different ways and kind of maintain. But I'm being how I am and how radical I am and how I tend to like go all the way with certain things. It got to the point where, again, I was told I was bucking the system, and they put me in pre-K. So basically, I'm like, I'm not teaching to the test. Like, one of the things that I was in the principal's office and said, I'm not teaching to the test. Like, I don't care what y'all do to me, but don't put me in a testing grade, because like 3rd grade and 5th grade were like major testing grades. And I taught 3rd grade, I taught 5th grade, and you know, the kids loved me, but administration didn't. So they put me in pre-K one year, and they tried to break me because that was really hard. I prefer to work with older children. And you know, that year in pre-K was hard. I had to take a pay cut, and those kids, like, they were asking me to like wipe them, and you know what I mean, and they're having accidents, and I'm just like, I'm not built for that. And that was probably was that my last year? That might have been my last year. Was that my last year? I don't remember the order of it, but I taught for 5 years in public school. And every year I taught a different grade. I taught pre-K, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. But I started with 5th. The first year I taught was 5th grade, and then the next year it was 3rd grade. Then the year after that it was 4th grade. Then I think it was pre-K. Then I think it was 2nd. I think my 2nd grade year was my last year. So yeah, that's kind of how it went. Ultimately, I got to the point where that was around the time that I started to learn. Like, I went back to school to work on my doctorate when I got into teaching, because I didn't teach right out of undergrad. I went into the business world for like 7 years before I started teaching. And when I went back to school and I started working on my doctorate degree, I took a class called Thinking in Systems. And when I took the class Thinking in Systems, it kind of validated like all the things that I was feeling internally that was like wrong with various systems, including the education system. Systems thinking, that whole theory gave me language and tools to better articulate what I was seeing that was wrong. And the more I learned, the more I felt out of integrity being in that space. I'm like, yeah, it felt wrong before, but now I actually know this. And it's like, if I can't be in alignment with the natural systems and the natural ways that young people show up in the world, and you know, I no longer want to be a part of a system that's socially stratified. I no longer could be a part of a system that said, if you show up in the world a certain way, that's what success looks like. But if you happen to show up in the world this way, you're not going to be successful. There's just no path for you to, you know, manifest success in that system because you are this type of person. And it was like, once I understood the ways these things were set up, I couldn't be a part of it anymore. And that's when I, you know, exited.
So you capture this understanding of like, I think we've all felt this, right? Like, these are the Facebook studies that come up. Like, you know, if there's a black teacher in the classroom, kids are, you know, predicted to do so much better. If, you know, we found out that microaggressions are a real thing, or that, you know, black women don't have access to health, right? Like, it's like, thank you for doing that research study. Also, I felt that in my spirit before we got here. Yeah. And so, like, this is the moment that it sounds like you have while you're in school. You're like, oh, systems thinking. This is kind of like confirmed everything I knew and provided me a framework. So, you know, 2-minute crash course on systems thinking. What is it?
Systems thinking basically is a theory that helps people to see that everything in the world is a system, and all systems are interconnected and interdependent. Like, literally all systems. It helps humans to see that there's no separation between us and quote unquote nature, like we are nature. It helps us to see the relationships between us and the natural world and nature as being, again, interdependent, interconnected. And it's like by honoring those connections, those interconnectivities and interdependencies, you find sustainability and balance.
Okay.
And you can apply that across every system.
Yes.
And find solutions. It also provides like different tools for helping people do those things. And that's what, that's kind of a crash course. Yeah.
So help us, narrow this down, right, into, because we're here to talk about black learners today, right? So some people are probably like, well, when are they going to talk about black learners? They're gonna talk about 20 minutes. I ain't heard the word black yet.
Yeah.
So what, help us understand what are some of the major systems that are impacting black learners in schools?
Some of the major systems that are impacting black learners in schools. So, trying to think the angle I want to capture that at. So I want to share with you all, like, when I was teaching, I was in a Title I school in a African American community in East Point, in Atlanta. And these were the kids that I wanted to impact, right? Because these were kids that grew up like me. I grew up in, again, inner city West Philly. So when I decided that I was going to step out of the system and start my own program, I decided that I want to start that program to serve those children, right? Serve those children who grew up like me, who look like me, etc. I didn't approach it from like an Afrocentric lens, in terms of like making the connection to Africa and all these different things. And it's like if you're gonna get reading, you're gonna get it from the Afrocentric. If you're gonna get history, you're gonna get it. That wasn't my focus. It was more so, I want to impact children that look like me, and it was like a process of evolution, right? So, one of the things that I realized early on is that if I was going to do education the way that I was endeavoring to do it at that stage, initially I looked at like charter schools. I'm like, I'm going to start a charter school. That was the wave back in like 2008, 2009, 2010. It was like charter schools were like the solution. You can have some autonomy, but you're still receiving funding from the school system, et cetera. So I dove deep into like exploring that as an option. And ultimately it was like, nah, because standardized testing lives there, and I want to get away from standardized testing. So then my journey took me to learning about alternatives. And my journey into alternatives led me to Montessori schools, Waldorf schools, democratic free schools. I did see some Afrocentric schools that like focused on like Afrocentric curriculum and the introduction into the various traditional, subject matter with the Afrocentric lens. I saw all those options and I evaluated all those different options. And ultimately the one that I fell in love with was the one that said freedom. So when you talk about democratic free schools, that's the one that resonated with me the most, right? So the reason why that resonated with me the most is because the main issue that I had with conventional schooling and the idea of like focusing on subjects, I saw those as boxes. Because I saw so many kids. At that point, I had also been learning about the theory of multiple intelligences and things like that. And I saw those as boxes. And I said, you know what? I don't want to do conventional curriculum because there's certain people who their intelligence, the way they're wired, is like book smarts. And those are the ones, and I was one of them, those are the ones who thrive in the academic setting where it's all about subject matter. And reading and writing and math. Basically reading, they call it the 3 R's or, that whole deal, right? And it was like the young people that thrive in those areas, they're always going to be the ones that have success in that. But there's so many young people who their intelligence manifests in different ways that don't fit within curriculum. And once I figured that out and I learned that, I knew that I couldn't be a part of any school environment that had those things, if that makes sense. So my school vision began to align with free schools and their vision, which was no curriculum, let young people learn the ways that they're naturally designed to learn, and basically trust the process of the way they were naturally designed in nature, which then began to intersect with systems thinking. So the Afrocentric part for me was, and you said, how did the conventional systems, impact, African American kids? So here's the thing. So I'm like, okay, I have to start a school, but the only way you can start a school that doesn't get funding, if you need funding, right, to start your school, you got to play that game.
Yeah.
If you don't want funding, it got to be private. Private school requires tuition. My vision was I wanted my school to be free because I didn't want any barriers to entry. I wanted a family to have access to my program no matter their socioeconomic background. So when I went down that road of trying to start this school, I ran into so many barriers because it was like capitalism requires money. You know what I mean? And it was like, yeah, I could start a school and it can be, $500 to $1,000 a month of tuition, and it can be sustainable within that context. And that ultimately led to a lot of problems. So that's one system. So not only the conventional education system provided a barrier and provided challenges, capitalism also provided a barrier. Was a barrier and provided challenges.
Gotcha. So you make this kind of point really clearly. Like, there's capitalism, money doesn't provide you the access to create an unschool or like a freedom school, like as you say, right? Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, inside of schools, because we only teach to really one modality, then those kids are kind of forced to learn a certain way, and you don't want to operate inside of those systems. So like, you got two systems. You got normal schooling and you got capitalism. They're both kind of impacting black kids in the design of the schools. You said something really interesting about this idea of like, kids have multiple intelligences, and so we need to teach to the natural ways that they learn. Right? And so could you open that up for us a little bit? Could you say a little bit more about like how do you see some of the natural ways that kids learn?
Yeah. So to frame this conversation, this is a conversation about self-directed education for our black learners, right? So self-directed education, the whole idea of even teaching doesn't really exist in this paradigm. It doesn't exist in the same ways that we understand, or I grew up learning and understanding what teaching meant. So with that being said, it's like I said to you, humans are born to think and learn. Birds fly, fish swim, people think and learn. It's innate. You don't have to teach someone how to learn. We're born to do that. There's a lot of people walking this earth, when I've had conversations with people, that actually feel like if a kid isn't in school, they're not learning. But the reality is, we're thinking and learning every moment that we are in existence on this earth. Humans are thinking and learning and processing information. The ways that we've been indoctrinated with a phrase that my friend and unschooling podcaster, Akilah Richards, she calls it schoolishness. We've been indoctrinated with this idea of schoolishness that says that the only place, like schools are the place for learning, and when you're not in schools, you're not learning. And we've been indoctrinated to think that learning looks like reading, math, arithmetic, through textbooks and through teachers, instead of understanding, again, just walking down the street and observing your environment is learning. If I have a conversation with you, I'm learning something, So in unschooling, there's no teaching. Adults are guides, facilitators. We model. And more importantly, it's like when a young person decides that they want to learn, we're there to support their learning. Whatever direction they want to go, we're there to support it. There's something called strewing, where, we absolutely have influence. You can put certain resources in the learning environment or the living space, or, go on certain trips and, you know, expose young people to different things. And it's like, and then you observe to see what they take hold of. And then once you see something that's a spark is in that young person's eye, then you can pour some gasoline on it and spark that fire even more by saying, okay, I know where to go get resources, or I know who you need to meet, or I know where you need to go intern, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically unschooling is like we follow the child. Instead of teaching and saying we have the answers and we're gonna pour it into your brain, we don't do that within the context of self-directed education.
Gotcha. I mean, I almost imagine a picture of like, so there's the picture of a pitcher you're pouring into an empty glass, right? Mm-hmm. But then the picture I'm imagining with you is like there's a room full of locks, and you're going and you're taking a key and you're trying this key into all the different locks, and then all of a sudden you unlock one of the locks, and now it opens up, right? And this is like what you're trying to find. So I guess my question is like, how do we help kids find those locks, right? Mm-hmm. How do we unlock those pieces in their brains, right? And what do you say to the person who's like, well, kids need to learn certain things, right? Like if they don't learn a certain thing, right? Because those two things are kind of like in conflict with each other, right? Like, well, I need my kid to go to college, or I need them to go here, or I need them to do whatever, versus like I need them to follow their interests and really unlock their potential.
Yeah. So I'm listening to your analogy about the locks, and I'm like, how can we reframe that? Because again, you're centering the adult in the equation by saying that, you know, we're going and trying to find and unlock these locks. We're centering the adult in that equation. But in unschooling, we don't look at it that way. At the most, in the ways that I practice it, in the ways that I understand it. We understand that every young person has agency. Every young person is adequate as they are. I'm not trying to prepare them for anything. I'm creating a space of liberation. I'm basically creating an environment where that young person can experience liberation from day one. That they don't have to grow up in a world where they got to fight for liberation. They don't have to ask for permission to be liberated. As an adult, if I choose to unschool my child or create an environment where self-directed education is the framework, they're growing up in the world in an environment that I'm creating where it's like liberation is the default. And who they are is adequate is the default. And what's going to happen is, as you let that young person evolve and grow organically, they're going to figure out, it's a lot of trust that has to be involved. And I'm going to give you all an example of how you can tie this in. But there's a level of trust, and it's hard. I want to say that. I know this is not easy. This is really hard. It was a lot, for me to get to where I am today in my understanding, it was really hard to let go and unlearn some things. But basically, again, I'm not trying to unlock because I'm not trying to prepare my kid to succeed in these conventional ways. It's like my kid is going to show up at adulthood and look out in the landscape of the world whole, adequate, empowered, and say, this is how I'm going to go and contribute. This is how I'm going to go contribute. This is where I see my skills best fit. And they're going to make their own path because they've grown up at every process, at every phase, making their own path. And it's like normal to them. It's normal to them that like what they want to do is like, okay, how I see myself impacting the world is okay. And there's this process, this natural process that we call like play, passion, purpose. So young people in their natural state, they want to play at a very young age. They want to play, right? They're learning through playing. And eventually that play turns into a passion. And they're going to play their way into like something that's a passion of theirs. They're going to find something that they probably begin to focus on and like really become laser focused on, right? And then there's this natural process when you become a certain age. If the playing field has been cleared for you to grow up this way, where your passion becomes a purpose. It's natural when you become a certain age that the natural things that you've been playing with, tinkering with, that became a passion and you played and tinkered even more, it never felt like work though.
Right.
Because you're still playing. It's just as you mature and your cognitive abilities mature, your play becomes passion, and so now you're playing at a different level. And then let's say you become a young adult, and now it's like that passion, naturally, you're like, how does that become purpose in the world? So now you're at a space where you're like, this is how I can continue to play. And that play may be like, it may be in science fields, it may be, I loved playing with, in the biology space, love playing with how animals evolve and grow and these various things. As a kid, it looked like I liked picking up the frogs that other people were afraid of, right? I love digging up the worms and dissecting them and things like that, playing. Passion, it becomes now I want to look and understand the name of these different parts because that's fun for me, because that's just a natural orientation for me to want to learn these things. And now when it comes to purpose, it's like, I've been playing with these, the biology of things. Now you begin to get that like language around biology and things naturally, and it's like, how can I go in the world and do this? I'm like, I'll be a doctor or I'll be a veterinarian. And it's like a natural process, and it never felt like work.
Right.
And I didn't do it for you. I didn't do it to please you, Mom. I didn't do it to please you, Professor. I didn't do it to please anyone else. I did it because it was my natural way of being. That's a totally different way of showing up in the world at the age of 18, 19, 20, 21 than showing up in the world of every step of the way, I'm trying to get those A grades to please someone else. Or someone said, that's how you make a lot of money, so I'm going to do that, which is the conventional track. But what happens on that conventional track? I'm sure all of us can look around at people that ended up in their 20s and 30s like, I'm not happy. I'm quitting this career. I'm going back to school because I'm going to figure it out some other way. That's not my path. Or I hate going to work every day, but it pays the bills. So one of the fears that people have when they hear about unschooling is that like those children won't figure out a way in the world and they're not going to be self-sufficient. It's like, no, that's not the case. They're actually going to be doing it, but they're going to be doing it from a different paradigm and a different understanding, and they're going to be showing up in the world as those people that when they do work, they're doing that work because that was the work they were designed to do. You know the difference between a doctor who's doing it because it's a great paycheck versus a doctor that this is art for them. This is art for them. They go deeper. They solve problems. They're the ones who like have breakthroughs. When you're working with a carpenter that, again, is just doing it because it's something they can do and it's like the only job they can get or whatever, versus to that it's like art. They create when they build and they fix things. It's like, and it's easy for them. It's natural because that's their natural way of being when they get their hands on that wood and that nail, It's a difference. We know it. We can say that across any way that people do work in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it's, I appreciate you for kind of reframing that, right? Like it's not about us unlocking anything for a kid. It's for them like living into their own purpose, right? And finding that for themselves.
Organically arriving at it on their own.
So, I made this promise that I was going to get us back to where Renee started at. Mm-hmm. And I think I found it. So, schooling versus unschooling, right? Mm-hmm. The whole reason why, and I think you talk a lot about this, like in this like theory of indivisibility that you talk about in a more broader way, but this idea that we need to create new systems because systems have already been created to box us in, right? And I guess the thing that I frequently try to remind folks is that somebody created schools as we currently have them, right? And created this form of I will teach you so you can become this working member of society so that you can be valuable to our capitalistic society.
Yep,
right?
Pretty much.
So now take us back before then, right? Because I also know you like studying history and going back, so help us understand how were people doing school before I don't know, somebody in American history sits down and says this is what school looks like, right? Like, let's go before that moment, take us to indigenous cultures. How are folks doing schooling? What does that look like? How are people, let me say not schooling, how are people creating learning environments for their children?
So, I mean, I'm gonna take you all the way back.
Okay.
I'm gonna take you all the way back, and I cover this in my podcast because I wanted these answers myself, right? I'm gonna try to jump around because it's so, obviously there's history, there's prehistory, but I do want to start in prehistory because I think it's important. So humans, and I know when I get into prehistory, now you bump up against people's beliefs about like creation, right? So I'll tell you all that I'm speaking from the paradigm of the discoveries that anthropologists and archaeologists, paleontologists, so forth and so on, all these various scientific fields and discoveries have made in the last 150 years. Sociology, I can name all of them. All the various scientific fields that like inform us today, they've kind of come to, everything has evolved. Literally everything has evolved, including these fields. So the evolution of these understandings about like how we've evolved as humans and how our world has evolved in these lands, etc. The technologies that have evolved in the last 150 years have gotten us to a point now where we can see back a lot further than scientists of, let's say, 500 years ago could see. I'm going to say it like that. And the reason I'll say it like that is because I know it's about 500 years ago that a lot of, like, when we're talking about the Afrocentric African cultures around, like, Mali and ancient Egyptians and all these various, like, amazing discoveries around mathematics and everything that happened at Timbuktu and these places, there was even history before that.
Right.
So I like to start with evolution because everything evolves. There's evidence for evolution even happening right now, and if you look at just the way things are, like everything evolves. So, with that being said, Homo sapiens, that's what we are, right? We are Homo sapiens, and Homo sapiens evolved out of Africa over 200,000 years ago. So the birthplace of our species is the continent now known as Africa. And for the first 200, all right, so Homo sapiens started in Africa and then eventually they started migrating to other places and other continents because back then all the land masses that are our continents, they were together. They were all together and you could literally walk, from Africa to North America, So over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, over the course of like millions of years, because there were other species of hominoids and humans that are now extinct that began to spread throughout the world, etc., before Homo sapiens did. Those humans evolved to create language. The ways that we use our hands, the ways that our eyelids, and the reason why we have eyebrows and eyelashes, and the way our teeth and our mouth structure, like all these things evolved over the course of like literally millions of years. And they evolved as adaptations, survival adaptations, right? Everything, so those early humans didn't even talk in the ways and the patterns that we speak in, and all these various things, like literally all these things evolved as adaptations to continue to survive and for the species to continue to progress. So early humans they lived in bands, small groups, small bands, like 15, 20, 30, 50, up to 50 people. And they were nomadic, hunter-gatherers, and they lived as egalitarian, meaning there was no hierarchy. Right. We all worked together, we all chipped in to survive and provide the food, and everyone had roles. That's how Homo sapiens lived for literally hundreds of thousands of years, up until about 10 to 12,000 years ago during the agricultural revolution. And during the agricultural revolution, humans figured out there were some climate change things that happened that made the land more fertile to receive the whole idea of farming. So for the first time in human history, about 10,000 years ago, humans were able to farm and cultivate land and become sedentary, and then build tribes and settlements around the food that they were growing. They no longer had to go out and hunt and gather. they can now grow and cultivate food. And when that happened, and I'm feeling like I even forgot the question. I want to make sure I bring it back to the question. Are we still going on like what Baileen's question was?
What does learning look like before we get
There we go. Before we got into the colonizer. That's where I'm going with this. Thank you. So, thank you. All right. So again, so that's when humans began to that's when systems of oppression basically enter into human societies. That's where I'm going with that. Because for the first time, when humans were able to become sedentary, and they were able to have like store food and have land over the course of, again, some thousands of years, instead of like sharing, it became like, okay, this is mine and my land, and now someone can come and take it. now I can accumulate resources for the first time that have value. And that's when these concepts of ownership and value and power over started to come into like play in human societies. And that ushered us into out of what was called the tribal era into what's called the empire era, as one scientist that I follow frames these eras. So the empire era, now you have things you need to protect, so now you build settlements and armies, and you go out and conquer others, and now you get war, and all these various things in ways that never existed for hundreds of thousands of years have only existed in human societies for a very small amount of time when it comes to like the grand scope of humans being on this earth. So because of so with that being said, all along humans are learning. That's where I'm going with this. Humans are learning, they're adapting, right? They're learning and they're adapting based on meeting the challenges of survival all throughout these eras, meeting the challenges of survival. And through that, eventually the humans, the Homo sapiens that ended up in Europe, who, because of, let's call it the lottery of like geology, they had these advances of being able to cultivate land and having like living in a region where they could grow barley and wheat and things like that. If you've heard of the term of the Fertile Crescent, which is now like Iran and Iraq. But that's the first place where they were able to cultivate these crops that led to the ability to have enough energy to build these settlements. So you went from you went from bands to tribes, from tribes to chiefdoms, from chiefdoms to states. And that's just numbers of people. So from bands of like 10 to 20, 30, 50 people, tribes were like hundreds of people, chiefdoms were thousands of people, states were like 50,000 and more people. When people became sedentary, now they started having more children. Women no longer were out hunting and gathering alongside of the let's call it all genders, because I have a better understanding of those things now as well. But let's say all varies, we'll say just woman is a gender, but I want to say like the sex of male, female, intersex. All those humans were doing all those roles. But for the people that could bear children, they now weren't out doing that work. So it was like men were out farming and cultivating the land, and the women were having the children. So now the men were the ones who were kind of like, that's when patriarchy came into society. I'll just say it like that. I won't go too deep. But that's you listen to that episode. But that's when patriarchy came into society, and now that created the dominance hierarchy to allow something like colonization to eventually become a thing. Yeah. That's why I'm kind of hitting these points for you all. But because the Europeans, they kind of grew, the people who lived in that region that we know today as European people, they grew these processes and these systems faster to allow them to kind of build empires faster. And build weaponry faster, to be able to go out and conquer faster. And that's why they became the ones to go out and colonize the world. It wasn't because they had any superior intellect or anything like that. It was literally because of where they lived and the fact that they were able to cultivate the land, as well as they had animals they could domesticate, and they could feed people and grow families faster and have all these armies. It's just like, just the evolution of all those things happened faster for the people that happen to live in that region, type of deal.
Are you talking about Iran and Iraq, or are you talking about Mediterranean, like Greece and that area?
It started there, but it spread for that. So that they're all connected,
Okay.
right? So from the Mediterranean areas, it also goes up into like what we know as Western Europe now and Eastern Europe, and also over into Asia as well. But there was this diffusion of like information and diffusion of like technologies and diffusion of all these various things that allowed those people to kind of have those advances that allowed them to go out and colonize first. So I just wanted to bring that context to the whole idea of what colonization was and how it got there. Again, my podcast goes into it in a lot more detail, and then the book that I got a lot of this from is called Guns, Germs, and Steel, that goes into a lot of that a lot deeper as well. But
Guns, what?
Guns, Germs, and Steel. So people in Africa, if we're talking, getting it back to did people in Africa learn prior to schooling? Absolutely. They were adapting. They were, surviving. They had their families, their tribes, their various things, and they were, learning the skills necessary for survival. So if it took farming, if it took hunting, if it took gathering, if it took whatever, that's what learning was. Learning has always been about adaptation. It's always been about learning the skills necessary for survival. So that, that always happened. If they had to learn mothering, if they had to learn fathering, as those things evolved, into society, like, yes, people were always learning those things. Fast forward into like the whole idea of like schools. There were even people on this continent, the indigenous people on this continent, that learned how to organize and how to live and create, settlements and all these various things without schools. Like learning has always been around. It's always been a human thing. The whole idea of school is so new. It's like 150 years old. Yeah. It's so new. It is so new. Humans have been building things, creating things, the pyramids. Like all these amazing human marvels have been built without schools being a thing. So, so that's like, to answer your question, absolutely. People of African descent throughout the diaspora have been learning way before schooling. And I know I gave you all a very long roundabout answer to that question, but for me, it's important to kind of bring the evolutionary context to these conversations.
So I know we got some questions
Okay.
in the audience, and there's a question here, and I just feel like there needs to be just one gap filler, right? From that story to probably because I think there's a piece where we need to kind of be as much as possible direct about this idea of unschooling or schooling, or like how we facilitate kids learning, right? How we help them oh, I'm sorry, I took it off.
I didn't know it was off already.
My bad.
Thank you.
I'm trying to be helpful.
I appreciate it.
So my question is just about, so you talk about, and I think that this frame is important, like this idea of undivisibility versus divisibility, right? And so power was created to divide people so that folks could maintain power.
Yes.
So now when we think about education, right, how do we teach our kids how to be cooperative? How to lean into values of undivisibility, right? That this isn't about me competing against you, but this is about us collectively getting there, right? Like, what does it look like to structure that type of learning environment? Or what are the things that we need to do to get out of the way to allow that type of learning to happen?
That's like the most important, that's one of the most important things that the whole thing about self-directed education, you'll hear when people say SDE, that's just unschooling. It's like those are interchangeable. Self-directed education, unschooling, they're the same thing. But absolutely, one of the most important reasons that I feel like it's important to take children out of those conventional schooling settings is because when you take them out of that environment where competition is the norm and individuality in a competitive way is the norm, when you bring them home or you put them in a school like Empowered Minds Academy, or other, schools that are centered around these principles, the ways that we get things done and communicate and work with one another, like, it's collaborative. Like, we're collaborating. So you don't have to teach someone how to collaborate if that's just all they've ever known. So it's like we're protecting young people, because collaboration is, again, it's like one of those natural systems things that are like innate within us. And I want to give you all an example of that as well in nature and how I make that connection when I talk about systems. But it's just natural. So when the main thing that I say, like, when we get out the way, like when you choose to unschool a child, it's like we're creating a path for them to grow organically. And by growing organically, when I say humans think and learn, it's also humans innately know that we're interdependent with one another. And we're interdependent and we're interconnected, and it's like those natural ways of being in terms of collaborating and getting things done together, they just happen naturally.
Well, I wanted to ask about, first of all, in the African tradition, I really felt like rites of passage was a schooling. So I would disagree with you on that. And I also believe that that was something that you had a lot of indigenous cultures. And through the rites of passage, it was used to help children transition into different positions, but they also had age groups that they worked in, where all that you're saying is what you see in their natural environment, older children taking care of younger children, and all of that too. And so I don't think it was structured necessarily the way we see it here, but you definitely do see children interacting in those ways in a natural environment. And I understand unschooling. I really, because I think that you do have to have a blend of it, and to be I think the day should start with, what do you know about this, or it has to have some guidance. I'm not saying that that's only one way. I think that you have to have multiple approaches to instruction. Every year I start my year off with the science, asking the students, what did you see about the science this summer? And they come up with their own science projects, and they do present something they've created out of their own mind. I don't give any instructions on how it needs to be structured. And I think that introduces them into, it draws them into the understanding that I observe, just like you said, science is something that is around me everywhere I look. And I can come up with my own way of observing that particular thing and conducting experiments that I want to conduct to examine this information and to affirm whether did I think what I thought, is that correct, or did what I think, was that not correct? So how can I go back and revisit it, or what can I learn, what kind of hypothesis can I form based on that? And that all people, every group went through that process. I mean, otherwise, how did we come up with the cultivation of honey, or the cultivation of like spelt, or the cultivation or husbandry? How did we develop these things? So it was a process of adaptation, but that is, to me, education. It wasn't like a formal thing, but it was, I mean, for me, I'm just trying to clarify what you're saying. Is that what you mean when you say unschooling? There wasn't, if your parents lived on a farm, you're going to learn husbandry. Or you're going to learn about corn. You're going to learn about grains. You're going to learn about yams or whatever. Or if you live in the rainforest, you're going to learn about palm trees, how to cultivate rubber, how to how to tap trees. So there was an expertise that was developed. So I don't know, would you consider that box? Because if your family only did that, that's the only thing you learned. Would you say that that was where we were boxing people?
So it's a couple of things. One, when you talked about rites of passage, I'm thinking about culture.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. Like, people pass down cultural you know, heritage and processes and things like that. You know, humans have done that. So you said, I want to get clarity, so I want to start there. You said in your mind that's like a form of school?
Well, I think it wasn't just culture, because if you had women who were midwives, your daughters learned how to deliver babies. It wouldn't be in a classroom, but it was through observation. If your family collected palm oil from palm trees, you may not have had like, this is what we're doing, but you had to learn the process for that.
Right.
And so those would be, some of that would have been a rites of passage as well. So it's not just, so that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. So basically, I think there's a lot of common ground in what we're saying.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that learning wasn't done in like a standardized like classroom way. It was like, again, it was in the context of like, this is what we need to do to survive, and this is our role in our community. And there was like that apprentice and mentor like exchange of like, this is how I've been doing it. Child, you need to learn how to do it this way to pass it along so that we can continue to survive. And that's what I spoke about, like learning for adaptation. That whole, you know, so it looks different. Like, so what self-directed looks like in 2019 looks different than what it would have looked like, you know, back then, or in those indigenous cultures and tribes. And also, one of the things that what anthropologists who study indigenous cultures that still exist in the world, and like pockets of Africa, pockets of South America, and like, you know, Australia, Papua New Guinea area, they allow the young people to play, and like, you know, the young people had a lot of like autonomy. They have, even right now, have a lot of autonomy, and they still are egalitarian. So it was like, and when they're ready to learn certain things, you know, they learned them to continue to pass down these like survival things. Different cultures did different things different ways, right? So that's a fact. So does that make sense? So it's like, yeah, I feel like we're saying similar things. And I definitely know those things happen. And those learning processes occurred. Those ways of giving knowledge. I think. Okay, so are you saying like when I said when I say there's no teachers, is that maybe the rub? Like, well, no, the adults did teach the kids.
I was just trying to make sure that was considered. That would have been. I think that would be unschooling
people off.
Yeah, huh?
I think the word unschooling
because I understand the concept of unschooling, and I think that you have to achieve a balance in that. I think children need to have a free environment, and you know, because we live in this space, you know, unfortunately, we have to have some guided learning. And so, but then within that, how do you create autonomy how can the children have some freedom in that learning environment in the classroom? And so I hate grades. I hate to give children grades. And so I created portfolios so people can see their work. I also have more project-based learning where they work in collaboration to build something, so I can see what they've done. So I don't rely on and I never teach to the test. And I have to give my children tests at the end of the year, even though we're private, but I never teach to it. So that's why, I mean, I agree with like a lot of what you're saying about that, but I just also wanted to make sure that we didn't have this idea that African people were not educating their kids, because I think it was more through their passing on of like you were saying, more of an apprenticeship or an indenture, you know, because you had smelting, iron, you know, and then you had and carpentry and all of these masteries of these skills. But I don't think it was voluntary. I think a lot of it was what you were saying, that people were it may have been more boxed than we think that, you have to ask permission in some African cultures to move into, like if you want to do music, and your family is, are an artisan of carpentry, you have to ask elders permission to move into another space. So it may have been boxed to me, even in our traditional cultures, there were some limitations of movement across.
Yeah. So yeah, I wanna. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that the other thing is important for like all of us to realize is that when you say our, for example, it encompasses, like in Africa, there's like thousands of languages,
Right.
thousands of tribes, thousands of
Right.
cultures, thousands of countries. So it's like it would be impossible for any of us to know like all of those traditions and etc. So it's like everything you're speaking to, yeah, that's absolutely true. For a lot of the traditions and the tribes and the cultures, and then the things I'm talking about is true for some of the traditions and the tribes and the cultures as well. And I think it's important to understand like the whole idea of like pluralism. Like it's like all these things exist.
Exactly.
All these things exist. They have existed.
Yeah.
And so yes.
So I think we kind of got to that question, which is like the unschooling and the balance and guided instruction. And I think there's an interesting thing, and you talk about this as you do a lot of trainings on this, right? Like around dialogue method, right? Or dialogue, right? And so the idea is like for us to have this conversation to kind of get to some new understanding, right?
Yes.
So not necessarily to impress upon like a particular way or whatever.
Right.
And I can kind of even hear like as y'all are having this conversation, this idea of like, okay, like, and so now how do we advance our understanding to this next place, right? And so I think it is interesting to think about, and maybe have you talk about this, like as we kind of continue to open this conversation up. It's like, okay, we want to do this thing, but I got my kids here, right? And I want them to like begin to embrace this idea of having conversation to get a new understanding and not to just be right. And I think they get these messages so early on, right?
Yep.
And I guess I want to maybe push right on this idea of like humans are naturally cooperative, right? Because I look at my 3-year-old and she's not naturally cooperative. Or I see some things that might challenge that. Sometimes she is very cooperative, and sometimes she's very like, this is my stuff, and don't mess with my stuff. Stay away, Lincoln. This is my stuff. And so like, how do we guide our kids out of maybe? And to your point, pluralistic, right? Like we got all of these things tied up inside of us, maybe as humans, right? So how do we kind of guide ourselves to this more cooperative space?
Well, one, you started out with dialogue, and I want to say, like, just in the back and forth we just had, that was an example.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to be right, and I don't feel like Dr. Noni, right? It wasn't that she was just like, this is my understanding. These are the things that I've modeled, and these are the areas that I've kind of understand, and these are my understandings. And it was like, and I was like, yeah, and this is my understanding, and that's why I was like, yes and yes. It's like, yes and yes. It's like, there's common threads in what we're both saying, and we kind of spoke to our commonalities. I wasn't saying no, you're wrong. She wasn't saying no, you're wrong. She's like, I want to include in this conversation the things that she added. And it's like, yes, please. Right? Because there's so much knowledge in the world. I don't hold all of it. I'm giving you all like my knowledge is like a small inch of knowledge in the world. My whole theory of indivisibility is a very small inch of knowledge in the world of knowledge. Episode 1, if you all listen to it, you'll hear me say I'm not an expert. And I also say I'm only giving you what I have, but I want people to please like email and add to, and like let's build on this knowledge and understanding. So yes, in terms of like dialogue, right? That's what it's all about. It's like we can learn from each other instead of being in this position that, because in conventional schooling we're taught that we have to have right answers. We're taught that we have to have right answers, because if you don't have right answers, you get bad grades and you get in trouble, and it leads to these competitive ways and these like closed-minded spirits and attitudes that continue to have people at odds. And conventional schooling leads to that.
So how do you help your kids understand, like, tell us a moment where you tried to break your kid out, like, we gotta accept a broader idea.
So, I mean, you gave the example of your 3-year-old, and you're like, I feel like I hear you saying that she's selfish. Can I say that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like
kids are selfish naturally, right?
Egocentric and egocentrism, and like, it's about me, right?
It's a phase.
Yeah, it is a phase.
It's a phase.
For sure.
It's a 3-year-old.
It's a developmental phase, because here's the thing, right? When you talk about agency, consent, boundaries, and things like that, they're developing that at that stage. They're developing their voice. The key is not to stomp it out. So the thing is, like, we're molding. We're molding. So at that developmental phase in their trajectory of development, is like, yes, you have to, like, I can never learn to set boundaries for myself if I don't figure out what they are, if I don't figure out my no's. And when I talk about these things around parenting, like, one of the things I always say is, like, one of the most, and this totally goes against the grain of everything that I was taught growing up, and many of you may be, and this may even rub some of you the wrong way, but one of the most powerful things that we could do as parents is honor our children's no. One of the most powerful things that we can do is honor our children's no, and here's why. Because we live in a world of coercion, we live in a world of manipulation. And oftentimes, we're kind of conditioned to say, sacrifice yourself. Sacrifice yourself and who you are to fit in, and etc. Right? Now, if you have a child that, and I'm going to get back to, I'm going to make a tie-in, but if you have a child that tells you no, they don't want to do something, or no, I don't like that, and you honor it, and you understand why they feel that way, let me tell you what you're setting up for them. And you continue to love them. You continue to, be a parent to them, be in like that collaborative relationship, familiar relationship. You still, if your role is to provide them food, at that you still provide them food. If your role is to provide them shelter, you still provide them shelter. All those things that they need in those formative years, if they can tell you no, and then you still provide those things, you still love on them, here's what's going to happen. And I'm going to bring it back to respect, because I know it's like, oh, well, what about respect? And I'm going to get there, right? But here's what you're doing. When they go out into the world and, they don't want to do something, or they don't like something, and someone tries to say, manipulate them or guilt trip them, and try to take love away from them, or threaten them by saying, I'm not going to be your friend anymore because you said no to me, or all these various ways that humans try to manipulate one another. They're going to have this they're going to be fortified to know, you know what, no, I was able to say no to mommy and daddy and set a boundary and they don't understand boundary, but it's like basically set a boundary for myself, and mommy and daddy didn't withdraw love from me. So if this person in the world is going to try to manipulate and use their connection to me or their power in that way to say they're going to withdraw love or withdraw affection or withdraw resources or whatever, because I set a boundary, that's a toxic, they instantly will say that's a toxic relationship that I don't want to have anything to do with. And I'll go find those healthy relationships of people who can respect my boundaries and still love me. Right. So we'll use a simple example. If a kid doesn't want to hug everybody in the family when you go to family functions, and you as a parent protect them and honor that that's a boundary that they have, I mean, you're setting your kid up for so much empowerment when they move through the world, to know that the way that I'm wired, someone's honoring my nuances, someone's honoring my discomforts, and I don't have to just go with the standard. The standard says everyone hug everyone, but that makes me feel weird and yucky and etc., right? And here's what happens. So now when you have predators, adults who manipulate children and try to sexually abuse children and these various things, whether it be sexual abuse and all these various things. I'm going to use that extreme for this example. Yeah. And that adult may say, you know, come do X, Y, Z, and if you don't do it, then adults will say, you know, do it because I'm the adult. You know, you got to follow. If when we were growing up, parents were always just like, whatever adults say goes, is where I'm going with this. Whatever, yeah, because I say so. Because I say so, there was the thing, all adults are always right. But if you create that level of relationship with your young people that says, no, you have a voice and what you say can be right as well for you based on your boundaries. If a predator comes to them and tries to pull that same act that I'm the adult, you should do this because I said so, instantly it's like alarms going off. Like, no, mommy and daddy don't treat me that way. No, what I have to say, I don't want to do that. Without the fear that if you don't do what adults say, you're going to get a whooping or you're going to get love withdrawal from your parents in the different ways, punishment, and all the various ways that I was raised and my generation oftentimes were raised around those things. So instead, here's what's a healthy way to do that, right? So now you have that young person that's in that selfish phase that's like kind of learning their voice, learning how to set those boundaries. We'll call it a selfish phase, but really that's what they're doing. They're gaining their voice, and they're really testing us to see, are we going to respect who they truly are? What you're going to teach them is relationship. Relationship. This is opposite. I'm trying to do this. Relationship. So with my children, I don't expect my children to do what I say because I'm the dad. If I really need them to do something, let's say it's something like really, really important, because a lot of people say, I need my kids to do what I say and like be conditioned to just do what I say just because without thinking because of safety. Mm-hmm. My kids do those extreme safety type things that I say because of trust, not fear. Right. They do it because they trust me. Mm-hmm. You know why they trust me? Because I respect their boundaries. Mm-hmm. I don't withdraw love from them when, and I don't try to like enforce power over them. And when I need them to do something that they don't want to do, here's the conversation. There's times when I don't want to do things either. Exactly. Yeah. Like literally just the same conversation you might have with a peer. There's times when I don't want to do things either, but the reason why I do it is because I love you. And it's like, if I don't do it, you're not going to eat. You know, but that's my role. You know, that's my responsibility as your parent. That's my role. And I respect that you don't want to do this right now. Even go as far as to say, well, why don't you want to do this? Or why don't you want to share? Or whatever it is that, you know, you're bumping up against in that moment. Let them feel heard. I understand that. I understand. And maybe even try to relate. Because sometimes, you know, when I feel a certain way, I don't want to do things too, blah, blah, blah. Try to relate to them. And then say, you remember the other day when daddy did X, Y, Z for you and got out of bed and made you breakfast and I wasn't really feeling up to it, you know, but I did it because I love you, I care for you, and I know there's times when I'm gonna have to do things that I don't feel like it in order to, you know, make sure that you continue to be happy and whole. And in this moment, it would really make daddy happy if you help me by doing X, Y, Z. There's times where you have that conversation that you really need to move them off of their pivot or whatever they're holding on to. You have that conversation, you'll find that they'll do it for you, even though they don't want to. And then there's times where it's like they don't want to do something, and the most powerful thing for you to do is not let them do it. Trust them. Like, okay, I respect that you don't want to do this right now. Tell me why. Okay, I get that. You're not up to it because of that reason. You know how much trust you're building in your kid by doing that? So we went there because you're like, how can you get them to get to the space of collaborating, right? So it's like those type of exchanges. So then there's going to be times where you set a boundary. There's times where I have to set a boundary with my children when I'll say, I don't want to talk about that right now because I'm in the mood or I had a hard day or whatever, and they respect my boundary. You know why? Because I respect theirs. So we've established that type of communication because that equal level of respect. It's not do it because I said so, it's do it because I love you and respect you. And there's times where I need you to do things because you love and respect me too.
That's restorative justice too.
Yes.
That's how we practice restorative justice as well.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question, but I also have a comment that I mean, I felt that so much because the way I'm an unschooler as well, and like the way I see it, unschooling isn't something that I do to my children or for my children the way people typically do homeschooling or schooling. It's something that's for the whole family. And it's more of a lifestyle. And when I saw unschooling in that way, unschooling and parenting in general just became so much easier for me, because it was just like, you know, it was hard in the beginning when I was just homeschooling my kids, and I'm just like, oh my God, I need them to do this thing. I need her to be at this place, and I need, you know, my child, even when it came to sharing, I need him to share. This is embarrassing. But when I kind of accepted that, like, no, like, this kid doesn't want to share, like, and I would have to tell other kids, no, he doesn't want to share, or like, oh, you don't have to do this curriculum thing. We can do whatever you want to do, and you're still going to learn at the end of the day. And I can also learn from you, because the amount of things that I have learned through this unschooling process has been like more than I've ever learned throughout my schooling years. Like, it just became so easy when I kind of viewed it in that way. So it was just more about me changing my views. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. I have a question, but I don't know if someone else has a question surrounding, because my question is a little different. It has more to do with race.
Can I make a direct response to what you said really quick? Because I think it also adds context. Like the first show in like deconstructing power structures, that the systems, the oppressive ones, I believe at the very root of every problem we have in society is our relationship to power. And we've all been raised and indoctrinated through colonization, all these various things, in power over. Right. What we're speaking to, and the whole thing I said to you and what you just said, is power with. Right. And a lot of times people they only think that that's something that they only going to work on in their relationships with adults. And it's like, no, we got to end oppression in every relationship dynamic. That includes power with children. So a lot of people don't think there's any way they can like raise healthy children if they don't have power over them. But it's like, no, you can. And we practice that, and people who unschool, like, they practice those things. And like you said, it's a lifestyle. And basically that's exactly what it is. It's like just being in a relationship with people. And power with, sharing, collaboration. Power with is collaboration.
I think you touched on it. I was just, thinking about the parents who are, for the most part, we're all schooled. The parents, the adults are schooled, and we're trying to raise unschooled children, so we fail at unschooling. And because it's not an absolute, it can look a little crazy. And we can kind of raise somewhat crazy children because at times we're inconsistent. A lot of times we're inconsistent. And so I have a child who's been unschooled and homeschooled and schooled and now has chosen school. And he's mad. He's mad that he doesn't know how to do the things he never wanted to do. So schooled kids learn to do things they don't want to know how to do, and then they can do them. And they get a certain level of facility out in the world, and so moving through the world, these systems, is a little bit easier to some level for them. Now, then as adults, they got to go to therapy. I get it. But right now, I got a 14-year-old who is pissed off that he can't write, that he can't spell, that he can't do all these things, because mom said, follow your passion. Do Legos. It's amazing. And he is amazing at the things he likes doing. But he avoided the things he didn't like doing. So in the schooled world, you don't get a pass. You have to do that. Now, he did choose to go to this school, and so I'm in this place where I want to help you. You chose and signed up for schooling, but I gave you opportunities for true freedom. He doesn't feel free in that. In this moment, he doesn't feel free. He feels stuck.
I would say that's, first of all, I understand what you're speaking to, and that, that struggle. And I would just say, like, it's a part of the process. And, it's just a part of the process. And he has to learn his way through what he's going through right now. And the thing about children who you've given him the freedom, like, when you're unschooling, like, you learn to solve problems and to create. Like, when you're allowed to learn naturally, that's what we do. When we talk about adaptation, all these various things, you learn to solve problems, you learn to create things you want to create. So he's in a position now where he can learn to solve a problem that he has. That's really what it is. So he decided he wanted to be there. So now it's on him to learn the necessary skills to thrive in that space or decide he doesn't want to be there and continue to learn at his own pace, and if he doesn't want to learn at that pace.
So to just let's interrupt that a little bit with what we know happens to black boys in schools. Because we've got a kid in the school, he wants to be there, and if he's not performing, then he's now subject, right? So when we think about the evolution of education, human beings learning to survive, there is an element of needing to survive in this environment, which is racist, which is violent, and so those things are like there are real skills he needs to survive in this milieu that school plays into good and bad. And so I think I'm also challenged there as well, the way that in his learning curve, who he is as a black man is not respected. So he has a triple, quadruple challenge. And I maybe you're saying, well, that's just bigger weight for him to lift and get stronger. And not everybody survives that mentally, physically, emotionally. I mean, the rates of suicide, like that is definitely something that's real for me. I don't want that to happen, and I know that our ancestors, not everybody survived either. Some people got taken out by the leopard. But I think as our evolution as humans, where we want to control our destiny, right? We don't want to be subject to the wind and the rain and the forest tigers, right? We want to be able to know that what I put in place is going to stay in place and it's going to bear fruit. And so there's a level of protectiveness and control that we as humans have evolved to. And so I'm just feeling a little challenged to
it's the balance. You have to find, and that's what I was saying. You have to be able to. I'm not disagreeing with unschooling, but for me, in my comfort zone, I give the children a voice, but then I guide it. So it's not I'm taking away all your freedom, but I'm going to guide it, because there are things you have to do. And then what I do is I try to create spaces where of your interest too. So it's not, I do the same thing you're saying, but I do it in a schooled way. So you're saying, allow the children, if there's a disagreement between the kids, okay, what happened? What do you think happened? So we always give them voices to deal with stuff, even if they have a problem with a teacher. They can come to me and say it. I look at you, why are you upset? What is going on with you? So we've created a space of trust, but it's in a controlled environment. So they can write, but they write what they want to write, about what they want to write, or they are learning things that are encouraging them to think outside of the box.
So they have to write. So it's like you have to write, but you can write what you want.
Right. So it's not. And then we don't have straight up school day. I have a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. That's core. Thursday, chill out. Do art. Go to the park. Friday they may have a morning of tests. In the afternoon, Telly comes and does drumming. So 2 of the days, and which is because of the way I learn. I cannot do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Straight every day, do the same thing. And I did not enjoy school for that reason, because there were days I wanted to do something else.
Right. So if I can, yeah. And so what I'm gathering from what you're saying, and I think the connection point is to what your concerns are, that I think is very real, is that there's this spectrum, there's this continuum of where we all fit.
Right.
And I hear and I respect that there's people who are doing the work to prepare young people to navigate the current systems. It's like what you're doing in your educational environment is like, I want to make sure I can prepare you all to survive the ways that things currently are. And what I'm hearing from you is your child, the 14-year-old that you're speaking of, may feel more comfortable with her expression of freedom in the environment that she's cultivated and created. Then there's some people, young people, that they're more wired like me, because we're all different. We're all different, right? And the children you're raising, the environment you're creating, ultimately, when we're talking about parenting young people from this like free unschooling type lens or self-directed lens, even if that it's like in following the child, if following the child realizes that my child needs her structures more so than if I had a school right now, what my structures would provide, it's still unschooling self-directed to say, I know that my child is better served there than here in the type of learning environment that I cultivate. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Like it's still
it's the child has to have understand choice, has to understand autonomy. I understand what you're saying about when they say no, because I think that children are spiritual beings too. So when they're saying no, there's something they may be sensing. And my daughter was very much like that. And I didn't make her go to people when she didn't want to. She's 28 years old now. She can read a person a mile away and tell you who that person is without talking to them. I mean, she has this face.
Yeah, these intuitions.
So I'm like, aha, you know. So she has a sensitivity, in my opinion, that's more fine-tuned than mine. So I try to respect the child as a spiritual being too. So there's more to it than just, oh, I have a bad attitude, you know, or whatever.
Yes.
Some of it is that they are feeling
intuitions.
Things, they have intuition. They have spaces that they are operating in, and that they can see. I have children who come to me who they call on the spectrum of autism. And I'm like, yeah, but look what they can do. You know, I watch and see.
It's a part of their magic, their power.
Look how you can do it. So it's all about empowering them in their individuality, but it's in a school environment.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's one question here, and then we'll go right to you, okay?
Oh, okay. Thank you for taking my question. And right now, I truly appreciate, thank you for coming and thank you for the facilitation. I appreciate where the field of education is right now. And the concepts of unschooling. This is completely new to me. I have a 16-month-old child, and I am quite aware of an applied systems thinking professionally and among adults who do need to learn collaboration. It is my profession. So we're in a space. I also live in a multi-generational household, and that you know, my mother came from a very structured place of subsistence farming family, you know, California, West Coast. We grew up on the West Coast, and so coming to North Carolina, things are very different for me here. And I guess finding an appropriate learning environment for my child, even in my first, you know, look online, I guess my question is, what types of characteristics am I looking for within the spaces that will provide him with education that align with my own? Like, what type of frame, if you say, you know, if I were to take a checklist with me, and what would those 5 things, what would those 5 items be on my checklist? If I I know I want to get away from traditional schools. My child is a child who he does hug a lot of people. He goes up to people a lot. So I'm actually having to inform his boundaries, or you know, I'm starting to think about these things like, we need to talk about this, but he'll run up and hug people, and so, and I love that about him, and I know that that will manifest itself into something great.
Know your child. That's all I can tell
you. He's, you know, and I want him to get to know himself, but also there's just so many options available.
So,
and I loved my upbringing, and more so the things that were outside of school that were presented to me.
Yeah, what I would say, I don't know if I can name 5 things, but I would say because your child is so young, it's a great opportunity for you to like just start exploring different options and just kind of filling them out. And I know one website that kind of has like a checklist is AERO, AERO, Alternative Education Resource Organization. And the Arrow website is like a clearinghouse for like all various alternatives. And you'll find schools that are aligned with all the different ways that we've been talking about different schools today. Everything from like the Montessori schools to the schools that follow the model like Valine School, Afrocentric schools, like schools that follow like all these different models. If they've connected with Arrow and like put their school on their website, you can go to those schools and see how they do things. But Arrow then also has like articles and different things. And one of the articles is like, is an alternative right for my child type of article, and it kind of like gives a checklist. But then from there, I think it's just a matter of like being patient, doing the research, and just learning, and then determining like which one best fits, where you are. And then also once you do it, then listening and learning and being flexible and agile in the sense that if something isn't the right fit, taking the lessons learned and moving towards what is, and understanding it's going to be a process.
Yeah. Again, just thank you for bringing and applying systems thinking to the home as well, and parental structures, because we're breaking them down.
Awesome. And thank you for what you're doing in your home too, because it all matters in us making the world a better place for our, African American young people and just people in general. So thank you for what you're doing.
What was the name of that website?
Arrow, so it's like AERO. If you Google AERO education, their website is like alternative education resource, but just Arrow education, if you Google that, you'll find it. So AERO education, Google that and you'll find it.
Thank you very much for everything that you said. Sorry I missed the very beginning of it. Somehow got the wrong times.
Okay.
What happens? My question has to do with poverty. And while we're speaking of something that, and I think it's a fine way to educate young people. I've had the opportunity to educate lots of other people's children, and hopefully try to educate two of my own, 4 grandchildren, and now 2 great-grandchildren. But I'm concerned about where we are as a people in this model. I don't know for a fact, but I can tell most of the people that you've been speaking to today have certain kinds of resources, if not their own personal resources, and the resources of family and friends who can help with this process. How do you speak to the parent who is, say, the single mom, who has to work, who cannot be with that child as much as perhaps the mothers in this room have had to be with their children, who ultimately have to rely on the public school system to deal with their children?
Yes.
How do you deal with that sort of situation if we're really going to talk about building a nation? Because most of our people are still in poverty.
I'm glad you asked that, because we kind of started there earlier when I talked about like the reason why my school is no longer open. So I have a website. It's igotogrow.com, and at igotogrow, that's IGOTOGROW, igotogrow.com. I created a video, and it's called "How to Start and Run a Tuition-Free SDE, Self-Directed Education, Unschool, Unbusiness."
I like that, all of that, because that's what I want to do.
I did, and I had to go through my process of starting a program within the confines of capitalism. But I came to that process from day one knowing that I didn't want my school to be a place that privileged some while disprivileging others, meaning the ones who had the privilege of the finances that could pay tuition to come would be able to get this, and those who didn't wouldn't be able to. And I knew I had to grapple with that from day one. And ultimately what I did was I had to like go through it and ultimately design myself out of it. And that's what that video is. It's like, this is how you can do it if you're a mother, a single mother, really for people like you who are unschooling at home, And how can you be in community with other people who are like-minded, who are doing the same things, without jumping on that idea that I got to go start a school and take on the debt of getting not debt, but the expenses and the overhead of getting a building and all those structures.
You can do it in your basement of your house.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me finish, get my point out. I feel like those people are the people who don't have nothing. They're the ones who are best suited for like creating the next system, the nation, however you want to frame it. But the thing is, we have to get the mindset that they're not at a disadvantage of doing it. And another thing that's at my website, I actually created a framework for walking away from capitalism and walking into a collaborative, interconnected, I call it Grow Interconnected. I created a framework for being in community with each other and sharing resources and our gifts with one another to be like a new economy. Because ultimately, we're trying to create economy where not having money as a resource is not a disadvantage. And it's like, so in unschooling, we deconstruct and we walk away from the conventional schooling system. But I went a step further. I'm like, well, how can we deconstruct and challenge capitalism as well? And that's where you'll find me. For people who are ready for that, that's where you'll find at my website at. You'll see Grow SDE and you'll see Grow Interconnected. And then ultimately, you'll see I'm working towards those type of things with Grow Indivisible. That's where my podcasts are. So I'm way out on this far, far radical end of things, and I understand that there's a bridge, there's a process to getting there. Everyone's not going to get there, and that's okay. And that it literally is okay. But my heart is with poor people. And ultimately, I don't see any solutions. And I'm going to say this. There's no solutions for poor people in capitalism, because in order for there to be rich people, there has to be poor people. There is no context for wealth without poverty. Wealth wouldn't exist. Like when people say, how do we end homelessness? Like we're going to end homelessness. There's no ending homelessness without ending, or how do we end poverty, end homelessness? The question is, how do we end wealth?
Yeah, exactly.
You can't end those things if you don't end that. They balance each other out. That is a feedback. I didn't even really get in the feedback loops, but you heard it. You heard me talk about it yesterday. That's a feedback loop.
It is.
Rich, poor, rich, poor, rich, poor. They don't exist without each other. So you can't end one without ending the other, but no one wants to talk about how to end wealth. You know why? Because how many African American people feel like failures because they're not wealthy? They're not chasing wealth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the trick is to get them to realize that's not the goal. That shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be balance, collaboration, being in community with one another, using our skills to support one another. That's the goal. So yeah, I'm sorry, I get excited when I get into that.
Thank you.
From 5 to 5:30 is our eat and mingle time. So I just want to say that, and my things to do for closing are, how to support Dr. Cynthia does have a Patreon account, patreon.com, Live Indivisible, and there's his website.
Thank you.
And Dr. Jackson, if you want to close it in any other way, that's me.
No, I mean, I don't think I have anything else to close. I think you ended on a really good note there. I guess you kind of had a final word. I don't know if you want another one, but I think this landing in this place of like, so frequently I feel like, and I think you talked about this in one of your podcasts, like we blame each other, or we try to look for each other solutions within a system that was designed to oppress us, as opposed to creating a new system that was designed to allow us to co-thrive, right? And so what does that, and I guess ultimately, like we came here today to talk about Black learners being self-directed, right? And so whether they're in a public school, they're in a private school, they're in a whatever school, if we aren't as a community directing them towards envisioning the right thing, right, then perhaps all of our efforts are moot.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know if you have like closing thoughts about that, but I mean, I don't understand in the way between food and
I do. I agree with you. I feel like that was a great place to end. And I apologize I didn't get to your questions, but I'll stick around and we can talk. But also the conversation doesn't have to start, because you can visit the website and you can get like, there's the discussion Discord group where there's like containers for like education and capitalism. Like we can talk about these things. The conversation can continue. We can continue to like co-create and brainstorm, you know. So I just want to say, and I'm like getting weak because I'm actually like hungry and thirsty and I need to use the bathroom. So you hear it in my voice. I just want to say thank you, you know, to everyone. Thank you to all that you contributed to this dialogue. I'm super grateful, and thank you, you know, for what you do and for what all of you are doing in the world. And you know, we're all doing our part and we're all making a difference. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.